All right, this is State of the Hack Black Hat Edition. I'm here with Sean Metcalf from Trimarc Security, and we'll be talking to him about Active Directory security and his experiences here at Black Hat.
Yeah, absolutely. So we all kind of have worked with each other previously. We run into your stuff. I know you from being the environments that are the best secured, and red teams knowing environments that you've secured. But like, I guess, so you have this reputation for being a pro at this level. For other people who might be interested in getting into Active Directory security, just security in general, could you give us some of your path to where you're at now?
Sure, absolutely. Well, what's interesting is a lot of security people tend to get into the field because they've been doing networking or they've been doing Linux or Unix types things, and they kind of move into that area. I find it interesting whenever someone who is a systems engineer or someone who did operations managing systems, specifically Windows, because Windows security has often been lambasted over the years, and so people who have come from that area often don't think that they can actually do anything in the security world. They feel like it's really not, there's not a path. So along the course of my career, as I was working at large organizations as an Active Directory engineer, I was looking at the security side and trying to figure out, okay, how do we fix this? How do we do that? And in 2003, 2004, I set up a kind of an informal Active Directory security group at the organization I was working at as a consultant. But back then it was mostly who is a member of domain admins, who's a member of this group, who has the ability to change passwords. There wasn't a whole lot to Active Directory security.
Right.
And then probably around 2014, when Benjamin Delpy and Skip Duckwald gave their talk at Black Hat, which is my first Black Hat that I attended, about golden tickets, it kind of changed that whole perspective.
Sure.
Now there's all of these types of attacks that have been highlighted and expanded upon since then. And as you guys have talked about, the attackers have been going after Kerberos, going after Active Directory. So it's kind of a brilliant merging, accidentally of course, that I have been working with Active Directory and been focused on the security aspects of it. But insofar as how I ended up doing that, it was more of a passion along with, this is what I want to do, let me figure out more ways to do that. And I've learned that if you volunteer for things that other people don't want to do, like figuring out what delegations configure an Active Directory, and then you do that, you continue to grow this level of knowledge that others don't seem to have, and it becomes very niche. And if you can dive deep into that niche, then you end up owning that, so to speak. So what's interesting is in 2012, I went after the Microsoft Certified Master Certification, which was this very intense 2-week training and certification. It was training during the day, and then there was tests on the weekends, or at the end of each of the weeks, multiple choice tests, and then a lab test, like a 9-hour lab.
Okay.
So very much the equivalent of the CCIE.
Yeah, sounds like it.
And it was grueling. There's a 20% pass rate. And I didn't expect that I was passed while I was out there. I figured I would get through some of it, and I have to retake the test later.
Yeah.
I actually ended up passing while I was out there. I was the only non-Microsoft person in the program that passed while I was out there. But I was studying, cramming at night. I had my entire hotel room just with Post-it notes and all sorts of things everywhere.
Sure.
I'm sure the housekeeping was really confused. But getting the MCM was part of that path, and in order to go after it, I had to do about a year of pre-reading to really understand and dive deep into how the technology worked. Diving deep into how the technology worked gave me a better understanding of how Kerberos worked, and I would do packet captures, go through the packet captures and figure out how things work. What happens when you actually promote a domain controller? What happens when you do this? And then going through and watching packet by packet by packet to see what's going on. And that's also when I dug into PowerShell, because I realized I could get more information from AD through PowerShell. And so this whole experience of making that decision and going that direction really set me up for success as things started bubbling, let's say, in the Active Directory security world. And I'm happy to say that now I've seen many job openings and career postings for Active Directory security, which is great, because that means that both someone has recognized that that's important, and that there's people out there that say, okay, I can do that, or maybe in a few years I can get to the point where I can be that Active Directory security architect or engineer or something like that, and I think that's fantastic.
And you put out a lot of great stuff on adsecurity.org, where you can, if someone wants to explore this a little bit further, you put a lot of that lab data out there, things that you've generated, explain, like you give people a lot of the tools to try it themselves.
And actually, so Microsoft hired me to do the update for the MCM for the 2012 version and update the pre-reading list, which was extensive. It was over 1,000 pages of reading, as well as some other content. And that pre-reading list I found online, and I posted on a link to AD Security, and I also extracted all the links and put those in a pre-reading area. So anyone who wants to know more about Active Directory, there's a ton of references on that site also.
Were you able to come up with questions for the test too, or just the?
Yeah, actually, I was asked to come up with questions, and it was pretty fun.
Was it fun coming up with like, all right, this is really hard. I'm gonna trip people up on this one.
Yeah, it was funny because I was sitting in a room with 8 other Microsoft people, and coming in as someone that's not Microsoft, I've never worked for Microsoft, they're looking at me like, can we have conversations around him? And I'm like, look, I'm under the same NDA through the MCM. I probably have the same NDAs at this point as you guys, so like I can't say anything. So after about an hour or so, and the introductions and everything else, everyone kind of loosened up. And at one point I came up with a question, and no one got the answer right in the room. And the guy next to me, who was the one of the PMs for the program, he's like, is this information public? And I'm like, I think it would have to be. It's from this presentation here. So it's been an interesting journey, and certainly being able to look at things and say, okay, well, that would be interesting, that would be a challenge, but never thinking that I can't do that. I mean, I certainly had many times where I was like, okay, well, I'm never going to do that. The MCM, I'm not going to pass. That was my thinking. Is this going to be really tough? I'm not going to pass while I'm out there. But I just focused on trying to get it done, focus on the first thing that needed to get done, and then worry about the second one later. I never worried about the lab test until I got through the other ones first. I never worried about what the next step was until I got through this one first, because otherwise it just seems too big and too grandiose, and there's no way you can ever get past it.
Right.
So 4 years ago in 2014 was my first Black Hat that I attended, and then 2015 was the first Black Hat I actually spoke at.
Yep.
Same thing. I put together a talk about detecting golden tickets and all this other attack type stuff that I'd figured out, and I sent it in to the CFP, and I'm like, there's no way they're going to accept this. Like, I'm not good enough for all these other peoples that I've seen speak at Black Hat and the history of speakers and these big names. I was like, there's no way I'm going to be accepted.
How'd you feel when Benjamin updated Mimikatz to make it so that the way you could detect the golden ticket could no longer be detected that way?
I laughed. I actually had a good laugh about it because that's so Benjamin.
Oh yeah.
You know, he is such a great guy. He's got a great sense of humor. Of course, to get about half of his humor, you have to know some French.
Okay.
I don't know any French, so I still laugh though because I think it's funny. But he is very much a genius in what he does. And he's very humble about that in person. And so speaking to him about certain things in person, having conversations, I was in Hack in Paris just in June, and having conversations with him there, it was just impressive because he was talking about things, and I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And then certain things I'm like, I'm going to have to make a mental note to look that up later because I don't really know what that means.
Furiously,
right. But he's the type of person that doesn't necessarily have to dig in and know all of the technology or the technical specs behind something. He can dig in and work with the code and just figure out from a code perspective and make things work. And he'll see the packets and be like, oh, I got to do this and I got to do that. I mean, he effectively reverse engineered Kerberos, Microsoft's Kerberos, not just Kerberos, which is a public spec, but Microsoft's Kerberos, which has extensions like the PAC, which isn't public, in order to do the golden ticket, the silver ticket, and all this other ticket manipulation.
Sure.
And so, yeah, when he changed it was a domain field that had a specific anomaly that was the original detection that I published, and then he just hard-coded one. And then after I think ANSI in Paris had published a white paper on how to detect against that new one, he changed it again to ANSI. And then, I mean, it was a matter of time, right? And so everyone kind of knew that once he hard-coded it, the attackers, as I'm sure you saw, were like, oh, well, we'll just customize our own Mimikatz because it's effectively open source. We'll just set the variable to be what the domain name is. And
you'd be surprised how many attackers don't do that, though, and just take that stock off the shelf, like, here we go.
Yeah, like no one would run PowerSploit direct from GitHub, right? Sure. That's just ridiculous.
I don't know.
I know it happens. But yeah, it was interesting when he did that, and eventually, I think that fall, he changed it so it would actually use a variable and set the correct domain.
I think one of the interesting things as a defender is one of the advantages you have is that the attacker doesn't necessarily know how you're detecting them, right? They don't know that what you're keying in on, and they may guess or try and figure it out or do something else. But that's one of a little bit of the high ground that you may have is in terms of, because you may be focusing on the domain name, but you may be doing something completely different to detect that. So they may think they're changing things up, and actually has no effect on your ability to detect them or not.
That's the difficulty we go through all the time on our my adversary methods team when we decide we actually want to put out more in blogs and explain to people how it is we're finding something, as you used in your example.
Sure.
That it's tough. Like you want to share that with other people, but then people might change something if it's tight.
And sometimes with some of these techniques that you have such a small window to detect it, or such small a way that if it gets released or the exact how of how you're doing it, then it could give you a big blind spot from a defender's perspective. So it's an interesting kind of challenge that you have, knowing like when and how to talk about things. So I at least find it easier to talk about what we found, not necessarily how we found it.
Yeah.
And there's very much a difference between like a signature-based detection method versus an actual behavioral method where you know what the behavior is. It has to do these specific things in order for it to actually work. And so therefore, if you can key off of that, trigger off of that, then you have much better success. And that's what I always try to focus on when I'm building detections. Like the detection I published last year on finding someone or detecting Kerber roasting. That's the one. That's how it's actually done.
Yeah. So you and I gave a talk at DerbyCon 2017 that we just made up on improv on the fly.
Absolutely.
I'm
Much like this conversation right now.
Exactly. I'm assuming a little bit more work went into your talk at Black Hat. So I don't know if you want to explain to people what you briefed on out here.
Sure thing.
And maybe your co-presenter.
Absolutely. So this is Bunny.
Special guest.
Special guest. My daughter asked me to bring Bunny out to Vegas. So Bunny had a spot on stage with me at Black Hat when I spoke yesterday. So I called it From Workstation to Domain Admin, Why Secure Administration Isn't and How to Fix It. So it's one of those talks that just came about late last year where I'm having a lot of the same conversation with customers over and over again and explaining the same methods that I think that an attacker could actually exploit this. Most organizations are still using a standard workstation where the admin logs in as a user, but then they RDP to an admin server or a domain controller. And about half the time they're using some sort of MFA. Duo seems to be the prominent one for that. So I started looking at, how could I compromise that system in a way that I could get whatever those creds are that they're typing in? Because most of the pen testers or red teamers that I've talked to and heard from and seen what they do, they're using Mimikatz to dump credentials from the system, or using NetSession to see where people are actually logged on. This is kind of a blind spot and a miss from that perspective, because the admin is not entering their credentials in a way that's captured by LSASS or NetSession or anything like that, but they are typing it in on that keyboard that's on that system. And so using a power exploit function like get keystrokes or get time screenshot or something like that, which I'm sure attackers are using, enables them to capture the information that's being typed into the RDP prompt, and then they have their credentials. And once they have the credentials, they're good. Like, they don't care about MFA at that point. So the talk walks through the different scenarios of how an attacker could exploit that scenario, of course, with a regular workstation. And then I talk about MFA and about how if you have something like Duo, and there's other MFAs out there that do something similar, where they have a default backup, which is the SMS or text configuration, where if you have self-service in the environment where a user can update their own mobile number attribute, that's often tied to the admin account that's associated with that user account. So therefore, if you can modify that by impersonating the user, and then you just capture their credentials, you can connect to MFA and bypass it that way. And you're nodding knowingly here.
We've done investigations of threat actors. APT29 is one of the ones that I know it's on this, where they, either got credits to a user or came back and used previous ones, access their email, say through like the Exchange Web Services API, logged into a multi-factor provider, say Duo or somebody else, registered a new account, that then shoots an email. They then access the email with single-factor authentication, approve the enrollment of the new one, and now they have access to, say, your VPN or your Citrix servers or whatever that are protected by multi-factor. So we definitely see that kind of a vector leveraged pretty deftly.
Yeah, and one of my key points to it is definitely MFA everything.
Yeah.
Like,
Sure.
use MFA.
All the things.
But don't count on MFA to be that one thing that's going to stop everything from else from happening. It needs to be one of the layers. So I call it, it's not a silver bullet, right?
Yep.
And you guys
And
know
maybe
this.
not use email as the
Sure.
main vector if
Sure.
you can avoid it. If you
As
can.
far as MFA
Yeah.
enrollment or
Yeah,
updating,
exactly.
Yeah, so one of the things we actually do internally is we have some orchestration set up where every time we get a new phone number registered, we'll then go and check things like our HR system and a bunch of other things to see like, is this like something that we know about, or basically like correlating so that when there's some random new one that's not associated with that user in some other way, we can then at least dive into it a little more deeply and say like, was that an adversary doing that or something else? So that's certainly from like an auditing perspective. It may not be a preventive control, but it's an auditing or detective control if that were to happen.
right. And then I found a very interesting blog article that was pointed to me by Jared Haight. He said there was a person that goes by Noopy had discovered or had put a blog article about basically how Duo by default is fail open. So obviously, if you can block that communication to that whatever API a record duosecurity.com, then you can just stop MFA from working entirely. So if you can interact with or influence the networking of that server, then it won't work. It won't go at all.
Nice.
So-
We got to take a look at that. Our red team released a real fish. I think we've talked about it previously, and that's another method to bypass MFA with a little basically intercept and stand up page that you fish people for their multi-factor tokens.
Right.
Right, and then use the it's obviously only valid for a very short window, so
Yeah.
you're getting them to enter the creds and the multi-factor token in something that they believe is real, and then you log into their other thing with that
Right.
that second factor.
The other thing I talked about is the MFA kind of double notification, where if an attacker is monitoring when the admin is actually requesting it and hit it at the same time, there's a chance that one comes through before the others, and the admin actually approves the one that the attacker
Like
had
it's like a race condition.
race condition, or if both of them show up, maybe they approve both, right,
Yep.
around the same time. And if it's on the lock screen, you don't have any additional information about what it is. You just,
like, yep.
especially if you come in the morning, you MFA a bunch of different things. You're not going to count. Okay, I got 4 when I'm supposed to have 3 necessarily. So the other part of that is awareness by the user to go, something weird happened. I don't know if I should report it. And certain things are like, okay, this looks like a fish. I should report this. I got a couple MFAs. I don't know if I got the right amount, but it seemed like it was okay and nothing happened. So I think
Yeah.
we're good.
Yep.
And someone would have to know my password. So how would they know my password? And I think that's another part of it that is always a little bit of a challenge from. So my recommendation is if anything weird is happening for MFA, absolutely let someone know and go in that direction. But
You should just wear the T-shirt that Benjamin has, like, I know your passwords.
right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
you also talked about how people are maybe how they are managing those passwords, right? Some
sure.
issues you've identified.
Yeah, so password vaults were part of that conversation as well. Enterprise password vaults generically. And the fact that a lot of organizations are starting to more broadly deploy an enterprise password vault, not just to manage a service account itself that then gets deployed or updated, so at least passwords change on that, which would be good. But the fact that there's 80 admin credentials, and either they're checking it out and copy pasting it,
Yep.
so there's a clipboard issue there, or they're proxying directly through that. And of course, CyberArk had a massive RCE vulnerability in April, and if your keys of the kingdom are there and someone doesn't patch quickly, then that could be problematic. But the other thing is that customers are not following best practices from the vendors. They're using users and putting user accounts into the admin group that can actually manage that password vault, which is extremely bad.
So what kind of controls, like when you see companies, like how are they most often deploying the systems? Like are they putting the password vault on like a system joined to the Windows domain, or are they like managing that as like a standalone system with like
They're almost
limiting where you
always
get there?
domain joined, yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, outside of that, there's no controls to protect or to determine who's allowed to connect to it. So
Right.
like it's open to the whole network usually. For example, CyberArk has 2 components. One is the web component where users can connect to check passwords out. The other is the actual updating component. I believe it's called CPM. And if you put the 2 on the same system, that's dangerous because now you have a web server that has passwords that are privileged that are passing through it. I mean, there's issues with web servers in general, but yeah.
Yeah, opens the attack surface there to something else.
So, yeah, I think it's very difficult to try to sum up, and honestly, you need an expert, someone like you, to come in and help people secure and properly architect your Active Directory. But are there any tips, any things you see that are quick wins, or maybe something people don't know about they should be considering?
So the most important thing is check the members of the administrators group in the domain as well as domain admins. People always seem to forget that the administrators group actually has all the AD admin rights and the admin rights of the DCs. Domain admins gets its rights by being a member of that.
Yep.
And so people seem to always forget that. People don't seem to check the settings in the group policies that are linked to the domain and the domain controllers OU. So those are settings and configurations and things that cause problems, that actually expand rights beyond what they should. So just limiting that access and making sure that it's set correctly is probably one of the biggest things that we see. We do Active Directory security assessments and reviews for Fortune 1000 companies, and tend to run into the same sort of thing every time. And it's a trend of, well, they're working on it, and then there's service counts. So you can get down to a certain number of admin accounts, but then there's service counts. And there's vulnerability scanning accounts, there's backup accounts, there's SQL for whatever reason.
I see vuln scanning accounts like all the time. They're like,
And
all right,
and
this
you know
account we put
why?
on every single box.
Because the vendor says put it in domain admins, this is
Right.
how it has to be done,
Yep.
which is horrible, because all it needs to do is hiccup, or if you have
Or
a
you just
server,
spray your creds everywhere on all
right,
your systems.
or if you
right?
have a server that's configured with unconstrained delegation, guess what's going to happen when that vuln scan account is actually hit? It's going to drop its Kerberos TGT behind on it.
Yep.
So there's a lot of issues with this, and I would love to see more vulnerability scanning products actually support agents or support the ability to break it out by workstation, server, and domain controller. Definitely not have all those together, because that's a huge risk.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Great info.
Yeah, and thanks so much for joining us, man.
Thank
We'll till the next time we talk. Cheers.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys.